In a world already strained by rising authoritarianism, unstable trade regimes, and fractured alliances, one country just made a move that could reshape the geopolitical order for decades to come. Canada, long considered one of the United States' most dependable allies, has signed a sweeping $150 billion defense agreement with the European Union. This isn't just a memorandum of understanding or a symbolic gesture. It's a structural reorientation of national defense priorities, supply chains, and international allegiance. For a country that has traditionally sourced nearly three-quarters of its military hardware from the United States, this pivot signals more than a policy shift. It signals a deliberate decoupling from a neighbor that has grown increasingly erratic and confrontational. The timing couldn't be more charged, with U.S. President Donald Trump threatening tariffs, cutting off trade talks, and even floating the annexation of Canada into the Union as the 51st state. Ottawa has responded not with appeasement, but with realignment, and not toward the east, but toward Brussels, toward an industrial, diplomatic, and military compact with Europe. As Canada deepens ties with the EU's SAFE and ReArm defense programs, this new axis challenges not only the economic integration of North America, but also the very architecture of NATO's Western Wing. So what triggered this realignment? Is it trade friction, political coercion, or long-term strategic divergence? And what happens now to the defense manufacturing pipeline, to digital markets, to aerospace procurement, and to the rules-based international order the U.S. once championed? This is more than just a bilateral story. It's a high-stakes reconfiguration of global defense economics with implications for everything from fighter jet procurement and raw material flows to cyber readiness and the future of NATO cohesion. Welcome to the new fault line forming between Washington and Ottawa, one that may run right through Brussels.
Canada's recent realignment with Europe cannot be understood in isolation. It must be viewed through the lens of macroeconomic interdependence and a geopolitical architecture that is rapidly shifting beneath the surface. For over half a century, the United States and Canada have enjoyed one of the most integrated economic and industrial relationships in the modern world. Today, bilateral trade between the two countries stands at an astounding $762 billion annually, making Canada the United States' second-largest trading partner. This isn't just a number, it reflects the entanglement of automotive supply chains stretching from Ontario to Michigan, aerospace systems produced jointly across Quebec and the Pacific Northwest, and critical resource flows, including aluminum, steel, and rare earths that underpin both countries' defense and energy sectors. Yet this deeply rooted integration has increasingly come under pressure. Under President Donald Trump's administration, the traditional language of mutual benefit has given way to transactional threats, unilateral tariffs, and strategic brinksmanship. Canada has been one of the primary targets. A 25% tariff on Canadian steel, a 50% duty on aluminum, and additional levies on foreign-made vehicles and auto parts have not only raised costs for Canadian exporters, they have fundamentally destabilized the certainty that long anchored cross-border industrial planning. As a result, companies on both sides have begun to reassess their exposure, redirect their logistics, and in many cases, hedge by expanding European ties. The pressure extends beyond hard goods. In 2025, the Canadian government, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, introduced a digital services tax designed to capture untaxed revenues from tech behemoths like Google, Amazon, and Meta. The tax was retroactive to 2022 and posed a new layer of fiscal friction in the already strained U.S. Canada relationship. American retaliation was swift and politically explosive. Trump called it a direct and blatant attack and abruptly terminated trade negotiations, igniting fears of a full-scale economic decoupling. While Ottawa ultimately rescinded the tax in an attempt to resume negotiations, the damage had been done, not just diplomatically, but in Canada's internal calculus about long-term strategic autonomy. This economic friction comes at a moment when Canada is actively reweighing its global partnerships. In parallel to the U.S. tensions, trade with Europe has quietly surged under the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA. Provisionally enforced since 2017, CETA eliminated tariffs on 98% of products and created a regulatory framework that has spurred significant growth. Since the agreement's implementation, trade in goods between Canada and the EU has grown by 63%, while trade in services has risen by a staggering 90%. European exports to Canada have increased by 61% in goods and 81% in services, demonstrating that the economic center of gravity, at least in terms of diversification, is already shifting. But the geopolitical ramifications go even deeper. Historically, 75% of Canada's defense procurement has come from U.S.-based manufacturers, including major multi-year contracts for platforms such as the F-35 stealth fighter. This level of dependency has long been viewed as a strategic vulnerability in Ottawa. The numbers are stark. For every Canadian dollar spent on military capital, 75 cents go to U.S. firms. This imbalance has effectively tethered Canada's defense capabilities to U.S. industrial policy, procurement timelines, and political volatility. The new agreements with Europe, particularly Canada's planned integration into the $150 billion Safe Defense Procurement Fund and the $800 billion ReArm Europe initiative, represent more than budget line items. They're insurance against that volatility.
This is happening at a time when the U.S. itself is turning inward, challenging NATO commitments, and using economic tools such as tariffs and export controls as instruments of coercion rather than cooperation. Trump's open musings about absorbing Canada as the 51st state and his frequent undermining of Canada's sovereignty have catalyzed a broader rethink among Canadian policymakers. The result is not an abandonment of the U.S., but a strategic recalibration, a hedging of bets, where Europe emerges not just as a secondary partner, but as a parallel pillar of both economic and security policy. In essence, Canada is now operating in a global environment where the assumption of American permanence, of predictability, of shared democratic consensus, of mutual restraint is no longer safe. And in that environment, building a robust transatlantic alternative is not just a political move, it is a structural necessity. The tipping point in Canada's unraveling economic ties with the United States came in the form of a 3% digital services tax, small in percentage but enormous in symbolic and financial impact. Introduced in 2022 and applied retroactively, the tax was designed to address a long-standing fiscal gap. American tech giants like Google, Meta, and Amazon were generating billions in revenue from Canadian users while paying little to no corporate tax in the country. By leveling the playing field, Ottawa intended to assert digital sovereignty and align its tax regime with broader global efforts to modernize the treatment of online revenue streams. But in Washington, especially under President Donald Trump, the move was interpreted as an economic provocation. Trump immediately called the tax a direct and blatant attack on the United States and responded by unilaterally terminating all trade talks with Canada. The announcement sent shockwaves through financial markets and drew strong reactions from U.S. corporate lobbies, who estimated their retroactive liabilities could range from $2 to $3 billion. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent signaled the administration's intention to investigate the tax as discriminatory, with potential trade reprisals looming. For Ottawa, the pressure became unsustainable. Despite earlier insistence that the tax would proceed on schedule, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government reversed course on June 30, 2025, just 24 hours before the first payments were due. The decision to rescind the tax was presented not as a surrender, but as a strategic pause in anticipation of resuming broader trade negotiations with the U.S. Still, the damage was done. The episode exposed just how vulnerable Canada had become to U.S. economic leverage and how quickly trade relationships could be weaponized for political gain. It reinforced for Canadian policymakers the urgency of diversifying their strategic partnerships and reducing exposure to Washington's increasingly transactional approach to diplomacy. On June 23, 2025, a quiet but historic rupture unfolded in Brussels. Canada, long embedded in the North American defense architecture, crossed a symbolic and strategic threshold by signing a comprehensive security and defense partnership with the European Union. While the ceremony was conducted with the cordiality typical of transatlantic diplomacy, the substance of the agreement represents a fundamental recalibration of Canada's military posture and procurement philosophy. This was not just another memorandum or joint statement, it was, in effect, a declaration that Ottawa no longer sees Washington as its singular axis of security cooperation.
The new pact grants Canada access to the EU's most ambitious defense initiatives to date. Chief among them is the SAFE program, a $150 billion joint procurement fund designed to consolidate and accelerate the development of European-made weapon systems. Unlike traditional NATO arrangements, SAFE is distinctly industrial in character. It provides financing and shared access to advanced defense projects, but with strict conditions. Only signatories to the agreement can fully participate in the bidding and manufacturing processes. With this deal, Canada is no longer an external observer to Europe's military-industrial evolution. It is now a formal participant, eligible for contracts, joint R&D ventures, and pooled logistics planning. Complementing SAFE is Canada's alignment with ReArm Europe, the EU's $800 billion defense infrastructure ramp-up fund aimed at strengthening domestic production capacity and reducing dependence on third-country suppliers, particularly the United States. This initiative was launched in response to both the protracted war in Ukraine and growing fears of U.S. retrenchment from NATO. By integrating with ReArm, Canada positions itself as both a contributor to and a beneficiary of this rapidly expanding defense ecosystem. It gains a new avenue for defense procurement, one not tied to the unpredictability of U.S. policy shifts or protectionist trade barriers. But the agreement doesn't stop at procurement. It also formalizes Canada's role in Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO, an initiative that enables joint military operations, mobility enhancements, and strategic interoperability across EU member states. Under PESCO, Canadian personnel, equipment, and infrastructure will now operate more seamlessly within European defense theaters. This means fewer logistical bottlenecks, reduced deployment times, and standardized protocols for joint exercises. In practical terms, it ensures that Canada can move troops, ships, and hardware across EU territory without the bureaucratic or political delays that typically hamper non-European forces. Critically, this partnership is also about resilience. By diversifying its military partnerships, Canada is insulating its defense supply chain from shocks, whether those arise from U.S. tariff escalation, arms export controls, or political gridlock in Washington. Canadian defense planners have grown increasingly concerned about the fragility of relying so heavily on U.S. manufactured platforms. The F-35 program alone, with its cost overruns and shifting delivery timelines, has illustrated the risks of dependency. Access to European alternatives such as the Saab Gripen or Dassault Rafale, along with shared research into next-generation systems, gives Canada leverage and flexibility it hasn't had in decades. Ultimately, the defense pact with the EU is not just a hedge against U.S. volatility. It is a structural realignment grounded in economic rationality and geopolitical foresight. It opens the door to long-term cooperation on cyber defense, space security, maritime surveillance, and dual-use innovation. It also signals to NATO and the broader international community that Canada is no longer content to follow the path set by Washington alone. Instead, it is carving out an independent role, one that is integrated with Europe, responsive to global instability, and anchored in multilateral cooperation. Canada's decision to shift its defense procurement strategy toward Europe is not merely a diplomatic maneuver. It is a seismic redirection of the industrial arteries that have historically linked Ottawa to Washington. For decades, the United States has served as both the primary customer and supplier for Canada's defense ecosystem. As of 2022, roughly 50% of all Canadian manufactured defense goods were exported south of the border. This arrangement, underpinned by long-standing agreements like the Defense Production Sharing Agreement of 1956, created a highly integrated North American military-industrial base. Supply chains for aircraft fuselages, guidance systems, encryption modules, and advanced radar components ran seamlessly across the 49th parallel. That model is now being quietly but decisively rewritten. By gaining entry into the European Union's SAFE and ReArm programs, Canada is effectively entering a CAD $1.25 trillion defense market, one that is expanding rapidly in both scale and technological ambition. Canadian companies will now have access to procurement tenders for everything from advanced missile systems and naval surveillance platforms to space-based sensors and dual-use quantum applications. In an environment where U.S. contracts are increasingly politicized, subject to export control restrictions, and vulnerable to the volatile tides of congressional dysfunction, Europe offers a comparatively rules-based and forward-looking alternative. This access is more than symbolic. It repositions Canadian defense firms within a larger transatlantic supply network that is investing heavily in resilience, interoperability, and strategic autonomy. The industrial policy implications are equally far-reaching. Canada's defense budget, which already faces competing domestic pressures, may see a meaningful reallocation away from American platforms like Lockheed Martin's F-35 stealth fighter. Ottawa had originally committed to purchasing 88 of these fifth-generation jets, with the first 16 already paid for. But the balance of the order is now under active review, not just because of ballooning costs, but because of a growing desire to reduce over-reliance on a single foreign supplier. In its place, Canada is weighing European alternatives, such as Sweden's Saab Gripen or France's Dassault Rafale, both of which come with fewer strings attached and greater compatibility with the EU's shared defense architecture. The ramifications of this pivot extend well beyond airframes and weapons systems. A realignment of this magnitude triggers ripple effects across multiple sectors. Canada's aerospace industry, already concentrated in provinces like Quebec and Ontario, will need to retool, both literally and figuratively, to meet EU standards and technical specifications. This will likely lead to new joint ventures, redefined engineering protocols, and a reconfiguration of labor demands, particularly in advanced manufacturing, software integration, and systems testing. There is also a profound impact on research and development pipelines. By aligning more closely with EU defense institutions, Canada gains access to collaborative R&D platforms focused on cyber defense, artificial intelligence for battlefield command systems, and advanced maritime monitoring tools. These joint research initiatives not only spread financial risk, but also accelerate time to market for critical technologies that are becoming increasingly essential in the face of hybrid threats and gray zone warfare. At the systems level, Canada's participation in Europe's defense matrix could reshape NATO's logistical architecture itself. If Canadian forces are deploying with EU standard equipment, following EU communications protocols, and integrating into EU-led supply chains, then the functional interoperability between North American and European NATO members becomes asymmetrical. This may necessitate entirely new frameworks for command integration, resupply mechanisms, and operational doctrine, particularly in contested theaters like the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Baltic Sea. And then there is the strategic dividend, the diversification of risk. Canada, by embedding itself more deeply into Europe's defense production and procurement ecosystems, reduces its exposure to U.S. political risk. It also positions itself to weather future disruptions in the global security environment with a greater degree of industrial and technological self-sufficiency. In the language of systemic resilience, this is not a retreat from alliance, it is an investment in optionality. It is the kind of hedging behavior one sees not in small symbolic states, but in mature middle powers recalibrating their role in an unstable and multipolar world. At the institutional level, the numbers paint a story of ambition constrained by fiscal gravity. NATO's latest spending benchmark, set to be debated and likely endorsed at the upcoming summit in The Hague, calls for member states to allocate 5% of GDP toward defense, 3.5% explicitly for military capabilities, and an additional 1.5% toward critical infrastructure, civilian readiness, and dual-use systems. For Canada, this is an immense ask. In 2024, Ottawa spent just 1.37% of its GDP on defense, placing it near the bottom of the NATO rankings. And while Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has pledged to accelerate its commitment to the previous 2% target, potentially achieving it years ahead of the original 2030 deadline, this trajectory remains riddled with challenges. Canada's economic growth is sluggish by G7 standards. The International Monetary Fund projects real GDP growth of only 1.4% for 2025, limiting Ottawa's fiscal headroom. Inflation remains persistent, and public debt servicing now competes directly with capital expenditures in both civil and military portfolios. Unlike countries with large-scale domestic arms industries, Canada must import much of its high-end military hardware or invest heavily in new industrial capacity, which takes time, capital, and cross-sector coordination. Every incremental rise in defense spending now faces a trade-off with infrastructure, healthcare, green transition projects, and even basic public services. The strain is further exacerbated by Canada's modest manufacturing base relative to the demands of next-generation warfare. Building cyber defense capabilities, hardening space infrastructure, and retrofitting naval systems for AI-driven surveillance are not just budgetary decisions, they are questions of industrial scale and technical depth. Unless Canada can significantly ramp up domestic output or deepen integration with EU supply chains, it risks falling short of the lofty goals outlined in multilateral forums. In short, while the political will may be there, the economic runway remains narrow and the institutional forecast remains cautious at best. The long-standing defense industrial base shared between Canada and the United States, built on agreements from the late 1950s and early 1960s, now faces the risk of partial erosion. These foundational accords once ensured seamless integration across procurement cycles, shared R&D programs, and synchronized production schedules for critical defense technologies. That legacy is now under pressure, not from external threats, but from internal strategic divergence. As Canada deepens its engagement with the European Union's procurement frameworks, joint manufacturing platforms, and defense innovation pipelines, the structural interdependence with the U.S. begins to loosen. The reality is stark. Research collaborations that once flowed naturally between Canadian and American labs may now pivot toward European consortiums. Procurement dollars that once sustained U.S. satellite surveillance firms, ISR system integrators, and naval electronics manufacturers may now be rechanneled into EU-based supply chains. This shift does not imply an outright rupture. Canada remains a core NATO member and continues to participate in NORAD, the binational aerospace defense command that remains vital to continental security. But it does signal a move toward greater autonomy, a recalibration of trust, and a quiet rebuke of Washington's erratic signals under the Trump administration. With each new defense contract signed with European partners and with every Canadian unit deployed under EU-led joint mobility protocols, Ottawa is hedging, not abandoning, but rebalancing. It is a strategic adaptation to a geopolitical environment where the once stable foundation of transatlantic unity is showing cracks. For the United States, this may seem like drift. For Canada, it is insurance. And for Europe, it is validation, a signal that its fledgling defense architecture is gaining credibility beyond the continent. As Canada charts this new course, it is not choosing one alliance over another. It is choosing optionality in an age of uncertainty. Whether this bet pays off in long-term security and economic resilience will depend not just on treaties signed or funds dispersed, but on whether institutions on both sides of the Atlantic can rise to meet a world that is no longer waiting for the United States to lead.